What does it take to write a truly unforgettable series? From Harry Potter to The Hunger Games, many of the most impactful stories and memorable stories have been told not just in a single book, but in a series of books told across multiple entries that allow the author to take the characters and the concepts that they've developed and build on them and expand on them and create a whole world and experience that readers can absorb themselves in. But for all the benefits that writing in a series provides, there are quite a few challenges and complications that are important to keep in mind. So for today's author talk, I've invited award-winning indie author J.A. Andrews to come and discuss her approach to writing the Keeper Chronicles, one of the most well-known and beloved indie fantasy series that I'm certainly aware of, and I know many, many, many readers have read and enjoyed and loved her world and her characters. So we're going to get a little bit of a peek behind the curtain into her approach to writing a series, everything she's learned along the way, and some great tips and suggestions based on her experiences that you can apply to your own writing as you work on developing your unforgettable series as well. You'll find links to the Keeper Chronicle books on Amazon in the description and pinned comment of this video, but I also wanted to highlight that she is actually running a Kickstarter right now for one of the most beautiful hardback special editions I have ever seen. I'm really excited to get my copy when the campaign closes. So if you're into Kickstarter, if you're into collector's editions, or if you just want the best possible format to experience this incredible series, then I would highly encourage you to check the link and see if the campaign is still running. And if it is, you should definitely jump on that and back it while it's still available. Okay, let's get into it. Well, welcome everybody. Janice, thanks for being on. Excited to dive into this. Excited to talk about writing in a series, which was a really, I think, really relevant topic because it's one of those things that if you read sort of marketing advice especially to indie authors, it's like you need to write in a series or at least a trilogy. But I don't feel like it's often explained necessarily why, or at least from the writing angle. It's not all like there are some challenges and some opportunities and some dynamics that have to do with doing a series well. So I'm really excited to dive into that and talk through some of that today because you are extremely well known for your series. I feel like one of the reasons I thought of you and wanted to invite you to talk about this, a lot of times when I see readers talking about how much they love your books, they're talking about the books as a whole. Like they talk about the Keeper Chronicles, the characters and the series across the arc of the story, not so much like this one particular book out of the whole, which I think is really cool because that means that it's doing its job. Yeah. So I guess to kick things off, we can start off broad strokes. Like, yeah, right. What a relief. What do you think it takes to sort of create a successful or a memorable series versus just a single book? What are some of the dynamics that you specifically have experienced in that process that are when you're thinking about the series as a unit versus just a book on its own?
I think the biggest thing for me is I feel like that the world that it exists in has to have space to grow because I feel like a book often fully explores like a part of your world, and sometimes coming back to that small part over and over, it can get a little boring. And so I really like having a
Yeah.
world big enough that book 2 can head off in a different geographical location or be more involved in the court politics as opposed to the outside the city or just something like that. Yeah, so I really like that the world itself, and as like writing the first book, I like to give hints, right? And even like just put little pins in my mind that like, oh, there's some weird group of people way over there. Like maybe we'll come back and talk about them in a future book and stuff like that. Just a sense that the story can grow out of the familiar part of book 1, but it can just expand into a bigger place. So as the reader can explore it, and as a writer, you can explore it too. You can find something familiar and kind of grow out of it.
Right. It's interesting that you're kind of starting with the world building or setting angle or aspect to think about. Do you think that in your experiences that's something that you planned from the beginning and thought about it that way, or did you kind of start by writing the story of the book you were writing and then back your way into scaling it out and realize that you dropped those threads, or was that something that you did intentionally as you were writing it?
I'd like to say it was intentional, but when I wrote my first book, I didn't I was committed to indie publishing it, but I didn't really think anyone would buy it. And I called it book one of the Keeper Chronicles, but I had no idea what books two or three would be. And I actually wrapped the story up pretty much at the end of
Yeah.
book one, which will fall later into our what not to do in a series. But
Yeah. Right.
yeah, but my main characters are these like historians and storytellers, and so they're very involved in like the history of the land and the history of the lands around them. And so it was all built into the story unintentionally that there were all these different places where the stories were from or histories or different things like that. So when I went to expand the world later, it was really easy just to like grab something from book one and be like, well, let's turn that idea into a full-blown story or a full-blown location.
Sure.
So that it was very convenient that it worked out that way. I wish I had planned it. And now I do. Like now as I'm
Right.
starting stuff, I
Sure.
I sprinkle in things that I could use later. But at first it was just a happy little accident that happened.
Yeah. I feel like that, I mean, I think most authors who are being honest will tell you that they didn't really know what they were doing in their first. I mean, I certainly didn't in the first book I wrote, and so when you can find when you're like, oh look, implications of larger things to do, like that's nice. Good job, me.
No, great job.
uh, I, I I think that's totally normal too. So, and so what do you think? What are some of the particular, I guess, advantages of writing in a series? Like we mentioned, I think it's broadly speaking, most people would say commercially there's an advantage because if a reader likes the story and the characters that they encounter early on, then they're a lot more likely to want to go on and continue reading versus if each book is a standalone, you have to do more work to justify it, I guess,
Hmm.
and make the case for it. Whereas like book four in a series you already love is sort of like, well, it's book four in a series you already love. Like, what else do I need to say? So there's definitely, there's marketing advantages. But from the writing perspective, what are some of the things that you think are advantages or opportunities that writing in a series offers you as an author?
Yeah. From a marketing standpoint, when I went to write the book description for book three of my last series, I was so tempted just to be like, this is book three. If you read book two
It's book
and you
three.
liked it, here's the ending. And if you haven't read book one or two, then why are you here? Like,
Why are
I'm not
you
telling
here?
you what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It's book three.
Yeah.
Just do it. Um,
Yeah.
but so for me, I don't hate writing the beginnings of stories and the beginning of a new series and the beginning of introducing a character
Mm,
is insanely hard. I spend probably well over half the time of writing a book just doing the first quarter of it.
yeah.
If it's a new character and a new setting and all this stuff.
Yeah.
If you add in world building and magic and all this stuff, it just I know there's authors that love that beginning exploration time, and I don't at all. So for me, if I can get book two to pick up where book one left off, and we have at least some of the same characters, and we have an established goal, and we have the magic is worked out. There's so much less pressure because what I really enjoy
Yeah.
writing is the characters and the character interactions, but it has to be
Yes.
like solidified in the world. And so when the world
Yeah.
is still hazy, I can't get the rest of it down. So
Yeah.
for me, writing in a series, and all my series are in the same world, and so the magic is
Yeah.
really similar. So that's really nice too. Like I don't have to rebuild for the reader even. What does the magic do? What
Sure.
can't it do? Who has it? All that kind of stuff. So it's really nice to have all that
Yeah.
foundation just set.
Yeah. The continuity aspect is certainly a giant advantage just in terms of yeah, just the mental time and energy. I feel like it's one of the ways, and this is, I mean, you and I are both fantasy authors, so there's a lot more like world development, speculative dynamics that you have to put in place. I feel like writing in a series is one of the ways we can kind of catch up to people who write in real world settings because
Hmm.
you have I'm always jealous of like you have all these normal frames of reference, like people already know what the things are. So if you're writing a romance that's set in Chicago, you don't have to explain everything about what Chicago is or what America is to people because they already know it. And
Hmm.
series can do some of that for you, for sure.
Hmm.
When you get and but I think book 5 or 6 of my series was a lot more fun, frankly, to write for me because it was like,
Hmm.
well, I know and the readers already know all these things and they know the characters, So you can start to, I feel like you can kind of start to develop some of that anticipation and payoff. Like you
Mm-hmm.
get to a point where a reader knows how a character is probably going to respond. And so then you have the fun of either paying off that expectation of like, oh yeah, there she goes, being her, or you find interesting ways of reversing that expectation, and then it's like, oh, I didn't expect that. In either way, the familiarity aspect can create some really satisfying reader experience moments that you don't get
Yes.
when everything's new and you're just figuring everything out for the first time,
Mm-hmm.
for sure.
Yeah. And I think in fantasy books too, and I think readers expect it, that a book one in a new world and a new characters, like I think they're
Hmm.
okay. It's probably one of the few places where readers are okay these days with a slower start because they realize like
Yeah.
they gotta learn everything that there is to learn before you can
Hmm.
actually get to the meat
Yeah.
of the story and care. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's ways of doing that that still make it like entertaining and good storytelling, but there's a
Entertaining.
lot of
Hmm.
developmental dynamics you have to put in at the beginning for sure. So
Yeah.
being able to, like you said, pick, say, same place, same rules, same characters, or, largely same
Hmm.
characters, and now we're going to carry the story forward. Is certainly true. I think also, at least for me, I don't know, tell me if you agree with this. I feel like writing in a series, what for me was the only way that I could build up the level of like meaning and impact and payoff that I was looking for in the story arc. Because there's
Hmm.
only so much you can do, even in a long book. You have limits. I think of it a little bit like what Marvel's done with their movie series, where the first Avengers movie worked because there had already been
Hmm.
individual origin story movies. And if you
Hmm.
hadn't had those first, and you've seen like you look at like the DC movies or some of the other settings that have tried to replicate that same idea, but they don't put the same work in to build that up to that point. And it's
Hmm.
like this is just too much.
Hmm.
There's not enough time for me to get invested in what's happening and get invested in these characters enough. So then you get to something like an Infinity War, or and
Yeah.
that pair of movies. The payoff of that, I think, was heavily based on the fact that we had spent so much time getting to that point, so we cared in a different way than we would have if you just tried to do the whole story standalone.
Agreed.
Do you feel like you got to some of that in your series later than maybe you couldn't have quite gotten to if you hadn't had the space to build it up?
Yes, definitely. And especially, and I know like fantasy books tend to have, we have bigger casts generally too. And it takes a full
Mm,
book, I feel like, to really get to know even a single character or a really group of core characters, right? But by the end of the book, maybe you understand them and you start to see like what they just overcame and how important it was to them and all that kind of stuff. Um, so yeah, then if they show up in a second book, like even if your second book doesn't have the exact same characters, but your first book, they do show up.
mm-hmm.
I feel like the readers are like, oh, like I get this person. I
Oh,
know
right.
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this,
Yeah.
and hopefully if they've enjoyed your characters or enjoyed hating your characters or whatever you're trying to get across, that when those people show up
Same
again,
deal, really.
yeah, they're like that
Yeah.
familiarity, right? It's like you show up somewhere and you see somebody you know, you're like, hey, and especially if suddenly they're in a new
Yeah. Yeah.
situation, right? There's all this back, yeah. I mean, I love that there's so much that's been built up
Absolutely.
to get to that point. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we've been talking a little bit about a lot of the advantages just from a writing standpoint of working in a series. What are some of the obstacles or challenges or particular disadvantages of working in a series that you have encountered?
Um, I think it's easy to end up with things becoming more boring and mundane, right? Because with fantasy, we want this like new place, this wonder, this people should be exploring and
Mm,
finding new, exciting things, right? And if it's the same magic system in the same world, I think there's a chance
yeah.
that you can write it and people can be like, oh, I already saw, like that's just another
Yeah.
story, same place, same people. So I think that that's a big stumbling block that you could fall into.
Sure.
And I think the other problem with the series is if you screw up book 2 and maybe it's boring or it doesn't end well or they hate the character, no one's gonna pick up book 3. And so then no matter how many more books you write in the
Hmm.
series, you've cut off your audience there book two. And I feel like there's popular series out there
Right.
that people are like, oh, books one, two, and three are great, and then just don't even bother. And so I think, oh,
Just don't keep going. Yeah.
right, oh. So
Yeah.
there's, yeah, with
Yeah,
standalones,
that's
I think
certainly
you get
true.
the fresh interest each time, but this could be, I think you can lose people to the point where they're like, I will not finish your series anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I know for me too, like we talked about, there's a lot of advantages to having continuity because you have things you're picking up with and carrying on from I also started to have experience that like the further on in my series I've gotten, it also does create some limitations. Or like it's like I have a story I want to tell, but I need to figure out how to tell it kind of using these resources. Like these are the characters and these are the things I have already established. And even if I have this really great idea for something, it kind of has to fit within that framework.
Yeah.
And it's sort of I have a lot of experiences where I'm like, man, I really want to go back and change this element in book 2 because if I just change this in book 2, then like now this thing in book 5 would make way more sense or would
It'd be
work or
so
would pay off
cool.
better and I could do it. But I can't like if it's already out. I can't go back and
Yeah.
make that fundamental change or foreground that thing. And that's probably one of those things that's more of just a writer frustration because like no one
Hmm.
else knows that stuff once it's out. If it you know, but that's definitely been something I've experienced where it does over time. You do become kind of limited to working within the frame of what you have established
Hmm.
for your series, um,
Yeah.
which I think is a good argument to be made for like every series has to end at some point, and there's a reason for
Yes.
there's when and where that is. There's a rationale for sometimes it's like it's time to end this because that's the other thing I think is worth naming as a potential con. Sometimes I think series can be dragged out too long for the sake of
Hmm.
I don't know hitting a certain number of books or because that's what the author had originally planned it a certain way. I think what the example I often think of is do you watch How I Met Your Mother? Did you watch that series when it was
Yes,
running
I was
or
just thinking of TV shows that do this. Yeah.
yeah, and a lot of TV shows will kind of do this where it's like, well, we're renewed for a season again, and we need to tell a story, not because we have a story to tell, but because we have space to fill.
Hmm.
And if you come in going like, I'm gonna write a 6-book series, or I'm gonna write a whatever, like because I'm planning it that way from the beginning, it's not a given, but it's certainly something to pay attention to. I think.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, whether your story actually is a six-book story or not, and whether you give
Mm-hmm.
the other problem is with each book in the series in general, and this wouldn't have to happen with everything, but with epic sort of fantasy stuff, each book
Mm-hmm.
sort of the world stakes, the things that are at stake in the world and the magnitude of the evil or whatever it is that they're fighting needs to like
Yeah.
ratchet up a little bit. And so by the time you get past a
Yeah.
certain
You
point,
can't roll. You can't go backwards.
yeah, you can't be like, and in this book, they're all just going to get lost and need to find their way out of the mountains. Like last book, they saved the world, but
Right.
now,
Yeah.
but then you can end up
Exactly.
too with this series of like the villain is like, like a god in book five. And then what happens in book six?
Mm-hmm.
Are they like the
Yeah.
king of the gods or six gods together?
Yeah.
Like, and you end up with these ideas that
Yeah.
sometimes like
The
they
power
lose
creep
their,
almost of
yeah, and it like
yeah.
loses its
Yeah.
importance because it's so over the top. So,
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely, and I think one antidote to that is for me at least, is to always come back to the characters
hmm.
and to really zero in on like what, because it's sort of like within a single story arc, you have character growth from where they started to where they ended as a result of what they've experienced, and you can kind of just like magnify that and think about it similarly for the series.
Hmm.
What's the resolution of at least my protagonist's character arc, and like coming back and rooting back in the character's development for me
Hmm.
at least is helpful to sort of say like, well, do I have more story to tell or not,
Hmm.
and like can you build plot around that to make it work, but
Hmm.
once the character is done, then the
It's
series
done.
is done.
Yeah.
At least that's in my opinion, that's a good way to kind of
Yes.
feel that out.
So the character growth and the character interactions are like the number one reason I write. Like I like it in a fantasy world
Yeah.
because I like the wonder, right? But and actually that was my big problem with my very first book because A Thread of Shadows, because my main character Alaric, he had this great arc, and at the end of the book he was just done. He had finished it, and I thought
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
he wasn't dead or anything. But when it went to go time to write book two, I was like, but he's done. Like I have nothing of interest left to
Yeah.
say about this
Yeah.
guy. And
Exactly.
so book two ended up being a different main character, um, which
Sure.
we'd heard about, but it wasn't really involved in book one. He was like lost and missing in book one, so no one knew much about him. And that turned out to be a huge mistake because readers didn't care at all about him. If they start book
Right.
two, they love him and they're invested. But I have so many readers who read book one and it wraps up nicely, and Alaric's story is finished, and
Yeah.
they're like, "That was sweet, great, thanks." And maybe
Lovely.
yeah, and then it just ends. So yeah, there's a
Yeah.
huge point that the characters themselves drive whether the
Yeah.
series still has life in it or not.
Right. Well, that's a
So,
great segue actually, because I was going to ask you specifically about cliffhangers and endings in a series. Because how do you strike the balance between um, giving people a really compelling reason to move on to the next book
mhm,
without frustrating them, and sort of like I feel like the ending is the part where you validate your reader's time and attention that they have invested
mhm.
in your story, and you can't just be like, well, to be continued in book 3, and I'm not going to give you catharsis or payoff because I
Right.
want you to move to the next book. Like
Mhm,
it doesn't work. That's frustrating because you
mhm.
feel kind of cheated out of the payoff that you thought you were going to get. But at the same time, like you just said, if you pay off too well and you tie it up, and it's like, well, there you go, story over. So
Story over.
have you, as you've written more books in your series, how have you worked at that, specifically around endings?
So that's an interesting question because so that first series, uh, each of the 3 books has their own main character, and, I did a better job at the end of book 2 of setting up the issues that would be in book 3. But again, like that
Mm,
character had to have his whole arc finished too before book 3 had this a different female character. And so um but at least we met her and we knew her and we cared about her and we understood what her problem was going to be. So that was good. So I think part of the key is like whatever goal your character is really working at in that individual book, they have to get to the end of that goal,
right.
achieve it at least in some way. And I think my favorite way to do it is they achieve the goal, but either there's a huge cost that they didn't see to it, or right, or the way that it played out. They don't end up where they thought they would end up, even though they achieved their goal. And hopefully, that point that their new point that they're at is a point that's dangerous enough that that readers want to keep going. Um, but yeah, I feel like if you leave your character just at a complete cliffhanger,
Yeah.
enough people get angry about it that that it, I don't know, it sort of backfires. But
Yeah.
my first book in my second series, I did my character Sable is trying to do this thing her whole time. She's trying to get this message across, and she does at the end of the book. And then everything she thought she was fighting against turns out to be wrong, right? She was looking at the whole situation wrong. She
Yeah.
was looking at the villain wrong. She was looking at whatever. And so she ends actually the end of book one, she's in the worst place she's been in, period. But at the same
Nice.
time, she did what she tried to do. So people weren't necessarily
Right. You
happy,
paid
but
off the story arc you were
yeah,
telling.
yeah. And people weren't
Yeah.
necessarily happy. But like my author's note at the end is like, "Hi, are you mad that we left her here because you look mad?" Because I was like, I'm sure
Don't
people
don't
and people would email me, they'd be like, "Yeah, I'm mad." But my pre-orders for book 2 were like through the roof, right? Because they were like, "Wait a minute, like the whole world just shifted
Yeah.
for what we were thinking, so now I need to know." So I think that's it. If there's new
Yeah.
questions opened up and your character's not like
Yeah.
we're not like scared they're going to die on page 1 or whatever of the next book or something, then
Right.
yeah, but I think it's a really tricky
Yeah.
thing to hit that balance.
Yeah. I think you named it really well though. Is like be clear about what is the central story problem of this story and the narrative arc of this story. Give that arc a climax and have
Mhm.
like let make sure there's clear catharsis and a resolution to the thing that was introduced at the beginning of the story that makes it a story. You can't.
Hmm.
That's not your cliffhanger.
Yeah.
That doesn't work. Thinking about, so I know, like I wrestled with this in book 6 of the Far Shore Chronicles. They find, like, Charity finally defeats the primary antagonist of the entire series up to that point, and it's done. But I knew I had 3 more books coming, and so thankfully I knew that well enough that so one of the characters in the group is a wizard, and he has been plagued by these, like, weird future visions. And so all the way along through the series, as those were getting worse, of, like, basically like an apocalypse, the end of the world, and he was quite convinced that it was going to be caused by the antagonist, and they stop him, and it's like, oh, everything's great, resolution, happy, we're all good. And then right in the very last, like, 2 pages, he busts in, is like, I'm still having the vision, like,
Ah,
nothing has changed.
yeah.
The end that I've been, and so, like, you again, like we were talking about in the series, just the fact that, like, I'd already done lots of work
Hmm.
throughout the previous 5 books to establish how bad this looming danger thing was gonna be. I just had attached it to the assumption that this antagonist was the source of it. So
Hmm.
that was like, okay, that's my way that I can have enough of a hook at the end of the, where it's like, you literally just saw the resolution of everything we've been working towards for 6 books, but don't leave yet, because there's been things happening, and if you, like, you'll see the, like, the little the droplets of it along the way. But that was like, I was like, how do I do this? Like, everyone's gonna think it's done and not gonna want to keep reading because you see it seems like it's over. So things like
Bad
that, like
data.
finding ways where you can, right, you can kind of, like, foreshadow or disrupt or bring those changes that that open up new questions or new
Hmm.
potential problems that are interesting. It
Hmm.
doesn't have to be a ton, but just enough to give that sense of, like, yeah, but here's what's coming next, or
Hmm.
why things aren't over yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you said, it's not easy to do, but it's definitely something to think about if you're working in a
Hmm.
series, because it's an important element of getting a series right.
Yeah, and I like the idea of the twist of whatever you've been working for 6 books, that everybody's on board, like, this antagonist is the problem, right? And then if you can do that twist where all of a sudden everyone's like, "Oh, this thing we've been assuming this whole time," like, it's, like,
Right.
if that assumption is
Our
taken away, like,
assumptions were
"Oh,
flawed.
no.
Yeah.
Now what do we
Yeah.
do?" So, yeah, I like
Yeah.
that.
What does that mean? Yeah, anytime you can get your reader asking, what's going to happen next, or what does that mean? I think it's
Mhm.
usually not a bad place to be in.
Yeah.
Um, and just in terms of, like, yeah, story investment. Um, well, and so I'm curious, and I'm guessing any, Keeper Chronicles fans who are listening to this probably curious as well. Do you have ideas or thoughts for stories outside of your Keeper Chronicles world at this point, or do you still have a lot of, story that you're working towards telling in that space? Maybe you don't want to, like, tip your
Yeah.
hand, but I'm
No.
personally curious, like, where you're at.
Uh, no, it's fine. I have, like, one world in my head, and that's all. I'm just always, like, amazed at authors who have, like, 15 different ideas in their heads for different worlds and different genres and whatever. I
Mm.
don't. It's all the same world. So everything, all the
I
short
think that's really
stories,
cool.
yeah. And so it's nice. It's just like I feel like there's enough. I have more directions that I have story ideas for than I will ever possibly
Nice,
get to writing. So
nice,
yeah, so I'm working on a third trilogy right now. That's like
nice,
chronologically, it'll come after the Keeper Chronicles, like 20 years after. Um, but yeah, and it's a
nice.
little treasure
Okay,
hunting and stuff, but same world, same magic, same
fun.
we have elves and
Right.
dwarves and yeah.
Yeah, all the good stuff. But that's great because, like you said, it's is as long as you're. I feel like it has to start from, as the author, you have to be interested. You have to
Hmm.
have that thing you're a little obsessed with in your
Yeah.
in your story thread
Yeah.
that you just can't let go of, and you want to go explore it, because then that's the foundation of building out a great story. So as long as you have that, and you're finding, like you said, more and more of those things in that setting and place,
Yeah.
then I think that's really cool.
Yeah. And
Nice.
it's convenient that as
Well,
a
I think
marketing,
that's.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I would say it's convenient that from a marketing standpoint, everything
Yeah.
connected, if not chronological, is like so much
Yes.
easier sell. I can be if you like
Yes.
this trilogy, the other one, same
Sure.
world. Yeah. So more of
Yes.
the same.
You get to come back to a place that you. I mean, and the thing is, like, I think that's one of the things that I love so much about reading indie series. Frankly, I think indie authors, hot take, are just a lot better at that than traditional authors, because you'll see a
Mhm.
lot of like with a lot of traditional author series, some readers have these worlds or these characters that they love, and there's like a book and then 5 years and then a book and then 8 years and then a book, and it's like I would love to spend more time in this place. Thank you very much. Like I would really enjoy that, but there's just not. It's not available to me.
Mhm.
So I think it's great that you have a world developed out enough that if you love it, if you get invested in it, there's lots of time to be there. You have lots of like portals into that place again.
Yeah.
And personally, I think that's cool.
Yes, well, I'm glad.
Awesome. Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for being on. This is a really interesting conversation. Everybody who's watching, if you have questions about writing a series or other elements of any of the threads that we picked up on or started talking about, please drop them in the comments. We'll be sure to tune into them. And if it's a comment that Janice would be more primed to answer, I'll pass it on to her and see if I can get her answer and pop it in the comments for you so we can give you feedback. But thank you so much for being on with us. This was great. I really appreciate your time, and we'll have to see if we can have you back again at some point in the future.
Yeah, thanks. This was fun.